Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Wilson. I am the science librarian at College of the Holy Cross. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mary Doyle Roche, who is an associate professor of religious studies at the College of the Holy Cross. Her fields of study include bioethics, Catholic moral theology and social teaching, Christian ethics, virtue ethics, and feminist ethics. Her courses include theological perspectives in medical ethics and a seminar on HIV, AIDS, and ethics, both of which focus on issues of intersectional health justice and the common good. And with that, I introduce to you Dr. Mary Doyle Roche.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for having me this morning. I am a big fan of our librarians here at Holy Cross and librarians in general, so this is a real treat. And as you'll see in what I have to say, I am not a scientist. You probably gleaned that from the introduction. I am I'm a theologian in a religious studies department, so I sit squarely in the humanities. But I'll say a little bit more about why science is so important. I'm going to try to share my screen, and it looks like it's working. So I just have to do the presentation mode, if I can kind of move myself around here. There we go. Does that look like it's working for folks?
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I called I titled the talk "Knowing Enough to Be Dangerous," and that's really because I really do have to work with scientific information and access to quality information that I can understand and use meaningfully in my research is really important. And that is something because I, as a sort of someone in the humanities, am on the lookout for scientific information that is really written for an educated but more general audience, right? So not an audience of scientists. And unfortunately, given sort of the polarized nature of now even of science itself, that's long been the case for people who do research in ethics and moral theology. That's becoming more and more difficult to do when you're not a scientist, to kind of sift through not just information that you may not understand, but bad information, right? Wrong information, and sometimes willfully, right, misleading information. So, I'll say a little bit more about that as I go through. Really, what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about how I go about doing the work that I do, and where this will intersect with, and then how it shapes some of the questions that I have with regard to personalized medicine. So I also begin with a land acknowledgement. And since we have already had one, I will simply add one element of my what I call a land and labor acknowledgement, and that is that Holy Cross continues to reap benefit from the sale of persons enslaved by the Society of Jesus and the Healy family, and we must honor their memory and their untold stories, repent of the history of genocide, slavery, and forced removal, and celebrate the many Indigenous and BIPOC peoples with ties to the land on which we teach and learn. So what I wanted to begin with was really just to talk a little bit about how we do ethics, and that there are, I just want to kind of just say really very briefly, right, that there are lots of different ways, lots of different methodologies that people can adopt when they are trying to address any kind of ethical question. But the ones that I am going to sort of just kind of highlight here, ones that are lifted up by Karen Labax, are particularly prominent in issues around bioethics. And just so you know, Karen Labax is a Christian theologian, Christian ethicist, but was one of the people who participated in the committee that developed the Belmont Report, which is kind of the standard document for research involving human subjects in the United States. But a number of approaches, right, that we can take. One that is quite prominent is a principle-based approach, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Also a human rights-based approach, which again is going to, when you're focused on rights, perhaps patients' rights, perhaps rights with regard to social justice, those are going to kind of shape the questions that you're going to ask about ethics and how you're going to go about resolving them. There are ethical approaches that are based in sort of a sense of duty and obligation. Casuistry is another, and it's one that I use frequently in bioethics and medical ethics, because it works well in that context, because this is really how physicians work, right? Casuistry is essentially an approach to ethical reasoning that's sort of based on cases, right? So you look at one case, you have a case in front of you, and you try to sort of uncover all of the salient elements, right? As if you were making a diagnosis, right? What are the symptoms? What is the history? And then kind of placing that case alongside all of the other cases that I've sort of gathered from my experience and my discerning community, right? And then to try to figure out if this case needs to be resolved in ways that are similar to cases before, or whether the case is significantly different enough that it warrants a different resolution. Virtue ethics, I'm going to say a little bit more about, but there are others based on narrative or story. There are approaches that come from care. Folks do ethnography and phenomenology. We'll kind of set those aside for today. Intersectional feminism is quite important to me. And then other kinds of postmodern approaches. And one of, I think, that the key things about kind of that sort of postmodernist move is really appreciating cultural difference. It would be, I think, a kind of a thumbnail sketch of that, right? So a suspicion about us being able to make any kind of universal claims about what is right or wrong or good and bad, and really kind of attending to particular contexts. And so there's a kind of a suspicion about anyone who says sort of this is right and wrong or good or bad, always and everywhere in all cases. The principle-based approach I wanted to just return to for a couple of additional minutes. The sort of the figures who are most closely associated with this in the context of medical ethics are Beecham and Childress and their Principles of Biomedical Ethics, which this says 2001. I can't even remember. That's 5th edition. It's sort of it was the kind of standard textbook, and they identify 4 principles by the time they get to the 5th edition. Early on, they just had 3: autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. And essentially, one of the ways in which a principle-based ethic works, right, is that you have a principle that sort of exists in the abstract, right? And you sort of deduce, right? You kind of apply top down, right? The principle to the case or the situation. And so these principles are sort of autonomy, which is really respect for the dignity of the patient, right? And when this intersects with a patient's rights approach, the focus is on respecting the autonomy and the decision-making of the patient, right? So it's whatever the patient sees or thinks of as right or wrong or good or bad or fitting for them, right, is really what drives the approach. Non-maleficence is that first do no harm, right? First do no harm. That's the sort of piece of the Hippocratic oath that's kind of seeped into the cultural consciousness, right? So physicians, healthcare providers, when they're trying to make a decision, a treatment decision, a clinical decision, or a research priority or protocol, right? Doing no harm is a key principle. Beneficence is the other side of that coin, right? Intentionally doing what is good for the patient, right? Wishing the patient good. So not an ethic purely of avoiding harm, but actively seeking to promote their health, healing, recovery. Justice gets us at some of the other kinds of systemic questions, right, that occur in medicine and healthcare. So not just about kind of a clinical bedside decision making, right, but other decisions with respect to sort of the distribution of resources and access, right? Virtue ethics is one of the approaches that I use most often in my teaching. And so for folks who don't know Holy Cross, we are exclusively an undergraduate school. So I'm not teaching medical students. I'm not even teaching nursing students, right? We're liberal arts. But one of the ways in which I approach teaching, right, is really thinking about or asking our students what kind of person they want to be, right? What are the qualities and characteristics that they want, right, to describe them in whatever situation or career or relationship that they're in, right? And then what are the kinds of decisions, choices, actions, right, that you can take in your life to really improve your ability to cultivate those virtues, right, or good qualities. So virtue ethics is really a goal-oriented ethics. So it's not working with, here's a principle and now I apply it to the case, but I'm kind of looking ahead to the horizon. I'm asking myself who I am, sort of with all of my strengths and my weaknesses, who I want to be, right? And how am I going to get there, right? Who am I? Who do I want to be? How am I going to get there? And with whom, right? Who is sort of the community of persons who are going to help me, right, to make the sort of right and good choices. In classic virtue ethics, right, which we get from Aristotle and Aquinas, the answer to those questions, who are you, who do you want to be, right, is you want to be prudent, you want to be just, temperate, and courageous. And those still hold, I think, for many people. But the virtues that I work with when I'm teaching shift a bit, right, to being prudent, just, faithful, and self-caring, to kind of honor relationality. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But prudence, basically, to be a prudent person is not to be an overly cautious person, but to be a person who has practical wisdom. That is to say, the kind of person who knows what to do, when to do it, right, and for the right reason. Somebody who has a habit of getting things right, right? Justice is the virtue that governs my relationship with everybody, people I don't know well, people I may not know at all, right? It's a way of sort of respecting all others and giving everyone what is their due. Faithfulness or fidelity is a little bit different, right? It shapes the relationships that I have with people that I do know and who are close to me, right? And so, oftentimes when we're trying to make decisions, right, we're trying to balance how we respond to people who have particular claims on us, and then how we are going to respond to other people, right? So the example I always use in class, right, is I need to treat all of my students the same, right? I need to treat them all equitably, right? And one of the ways in which I do that is I come to class, I teach my courses, I read their work, I, assess their work and things like that. But if the school nurse were to call me, right, saying that one of my children is ill, I will probably leave the class to go get my child, because my child has a particular claim on me. Sometimes my children have to wait and my students come first, right? But that's part of the ethical discernment. But the fourth is self-care. And this is, I think, really critical when we're talking about medical ethics, advocating for yourself, but also, certainly caring for yourself and for your health. But also when we think about ethical decisions on the part of healthcare professionals, right? Who need a lot of self-care in order to be able to do their work. And we certainly see that happening a lot today in the context of COVID. When I apply this sort of virtue ethics approach to my courses in medical ethics, we think about the virtues that we need, one, when we're patients, for sure, but also we try to kind of sketch who sort of the good physician is, right? What kinds of qualities, characteristics, virtues do people need in order to be a physician or any kind of healthcare professional? And for this, we turn to Edmund Pellegrino, who is really kind of a leader in this approach to medicine. He's passed away a few years ago, but he identifies fidelity to trust, right? So this element of faithfulness to the relationship that a physician has with particular patients, benevolence, again, right? Wishing them well, and intellectual honesty, right? And this one is particularly relevant for what I'll be saying later in the presentation, right? But intellectual honesty, being clear about what I know and what I don't know. What are the limits of my own understanding and where I might need, even as the physician, to ask for help from another physician or from a specialist, or even to kind of be honest about the limits of what the science and the medicine can do. Courage, we certainly see that in our healthcare professionals all the time. Compassion, right, which is in Pellegrino's view, compassion really has to do with the ability to imagine yourself or to be able to feel something of the plight and the suffering of the patient, right? That's a really important ability. And because it's a virtue, right, it observes a kind of mean, right? We need physicians who are compassionate, right, but who are not so emotionally invested with every patient that it becomes difficult for them, right, to do their work. So they're balancing. And then honesty, right, truthfulness, telling patients the truth, which can be really challenging, especially when the truth is hard and painful. But those are the key elements that Pellegrino highlights. So I just want to shift a little bit now to talk about how these kinds of approaches work in the context of theological ethics, right? Which is what I do. And I do that in the Christian tradition, even more particularly, I do that in the Catholic moral tradition. And, obviously the practice of medicine happens in a very pluralistic space. I do work with my students. I'm teaching at a Catholic school, so there's a space for this kind of reflection at Holy Cross. But the other thing that I try to tell my students is not so much that I need them to kind of believe what Christians and Catholics believe and reach the same kinds of conclusions, but to recognize that for better or worse, the Catholic Church is a major provider of healthcare in the United States, in the world, really. We are familiar with Catholic hospitals, and so sometimes it's really important for people to know how those institutions are going to go about making clinical decisions, but also policy decisions, right? And for folks who are particularly interested in some of the thornier questions in Catholic moral theology, this happens primarily with regard to reproductive health, right? So I also want people to be able to make responsible decisions about where they're going to find the best and most inclusive and affirming care, which is sadly not always in a Catholic hospital. But when Christian ethics goes about looking at any kind of ethical issue, including biomedical questions, right? They look to sort of four general areas. They use sort of four general sources, right? We talk about revelation and sacred text. So for Christians, this is the Bible. Other religions, Judaism, Hebrew Bible, Islam, the Quran. So other religions also have sacred texts. They think about whether they are the revealed word of a divine being in different ways. But even secular ethics will have its own canon, right? So people who are not doing religious ethics at all still give pride of place to a number of philosophers, for example. But those are sort of key, right? The biblical text, the biblical narrative. And in terms of medical ethics, for Christians, often the healing narratives of Jesus play a central role. But the other thing that's really central for Christian ethics is what we kind of refer to in Catholic moral theology as reason and the natural law. Different denominations within Christianity will approach this a bit differently, but what I think is surprising for a lot of people is that the Christian tradition has a long tradition, centuries, millennia, of making decisions with sort of whatever the best science we have at the time, right? This is where we get into a little bit of tension because we have, again, some revered theological figures like Augustine, like Aquinas, and many sort of saints, right? But we can also even look at the Bible, right, in this way, that those sort of, theologians that people still turn to for wisdom were really limited in their scientific understanding, right? And so, again, some of the examples have to do with reproductive health, right? So Catholic moral theology can kind of really still stick to the wisdom of people like Augustine and Aquinas, who, to put it simply, did not know where babies came from, right? And so how can we adjust our theological and ethical thinking based on the best science that is available to us? I think often the wider culture kind of pits science and religion in tension with each other, but that's not really the lived practice of many sort of Christian ethicists. They are really looking to the STEM fields, but also to the social sciences, right? So sociology, psychology, economics, right? We can't really talk about what is just and equitable in a healthcare market without partnering with people who are skilled, right, in assessing the economics of healthcare. We can't talk about, how to sort of protect people or prevent certain kinds of diseases and viruses and infections if we don't really have a good sense of how they're transmitted. And when we have bad information, that leads to sort of bad ethical decisions, right? We also look at tradition, again, kind of the long tradition of documents and things like that, but also the kinds of habits that Christian communities have cultivated over the centuries, right? So again, not always succeeding as well as we would have liked, but Christian communities have since the beginning been interested in care for the poor and for those who are ill, right? Sometimes what our interventions there are not actually helpful, but we don't really have to begin our theological reflection with questions like, should we care about people who are poor and suffering? That question is long answered in our tradition. The question for us now is how to do that better and better and better, right? But the other piece, source that we look at is experience, right? The lived experience of people, my own lived experience, but also kind of moving out into the lived experience of other people, right? That our experience has wisdom, and we bring that to our ethical reflection. So when I do my work in medical ethics or any topic, right, I adapt the sort of the methodological approach of Catholic social teaching, which kind of organizes these sources in a particular way, right? And it begins actually not really with the Bible, it begins with lived experience. And of course, this is sort of really a cycle and a spiral that's always continuing. So I always come to an experience with everything that I've engaged with scripture and theology and tradition and other disciplines. But when we're confronted with a moral question, we begin on the ground with the lived experience of people who are most directly affected by what's going on, right? We want to get a sense of what's going on, what they're experiencing, what their needs are, what their desires are, right? What their challenges are. And then we do some really kind of analysis of that using all of these other disciplinary perspectives, right? So I'm looking at the experience of an illness. I'm going to try to see how that's impacting a community. We can see this in COVID, right? So to figure that out more, I'm going to have to analyze that in light of what virologists are saying, for example, how they understand it, but also how people doing against social science are seeing how this has disrupted economies, how this is affecting us psychologically, right? All of those kinds of things to help me analyze the situation. Only then do I bring all of that information into a process of theological reflection, where I am sort of returning to the scriptures and the stories that shape my moral community, the traditions that we have in Christian communities, right? And after I have done that, right, this sort of entered into an experience, really tried to think well about it in a kind of a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary way, reflected on that in light of what I believe, right? And the kind of person I hope to be, or the community that I hope we want to be, then and only then do we decide what we're going to do. Right. And because if I skip all of these other phases, right, and simply say, oh, I'm going to run there in and help, right, I can be very well meaning, but I can also do a lot of damage. Right. And in a medical context, that can have catastrophic kinds of consequences. Right. And once I've made a decision about something, that could be a personal decision, that could be a public policy decision, right? We kind of evaluate what happens, and we begin the cycle again, right? And hopefully in encountering this cycle, right, we are getting better and better at our responses to moral questions. The way you can kind of think of spiraling up, or you could think of spiraling down, right? And not getting worse, right? That you're getting better at responding because you're getting deeper and deeper and deeper to the root causes of what the ethical challenge is in the first place, right? How does any of this, right, connect to these questions of personalized medicine? So I'll just take a couple of more minutes and then I'll open it up for some questions, right? But when I'm teaching medical ethics here at Holy Cross, we talk about medicine, particularly when you're doing that from the perspective of the patient, right? The patient-centered approach, right? Not the physician-centered approach, right? But the patient-centered approach. How we think about the deeply personal experience of illness, right? And it is deeply personal. And stories of illness, memoirs, right? And our own experience from ourselves as patients or people that we care deeply about, right? Is that personal experience can be deeply isolating, because in some ways the suffering that you experience is radically unique, right? It's radically unique because we're radically unique people. But we're also sort of really radically social, right? That's a core commitment of Christian ethics, but the ethical perspective of many religious and secular traditions, right? So what is really personal to me doesn't mean that it doesn't affect other people, and that I'm not really in a kind of a web or a network of, again, these kind of interpersonal relationships, but also relationships of sort of justice and equity. And so one of the questions that I try to work with my students about, right, is kind of taking this insight here, which we have from the Tavistock group, which is kind of an unofficial, sort of sense of how medical ethics should proceed, right? The personal experience of illness is the principal concern of patients. So it's the principal concern of healthcare, right? Healthcare professionals and healthcare systems focus on the patient. But in the world that we're living in, right, and Paul Farmer now also resting in peace and power, hopefully, the founder of Partners in Health and author of many books, but I have here just a selection of something from his Pathologies of Power. So he notes the sort of limiting focus, right, of sort of a purely personal view of healthcare, right? He says this priority, this personal attention, is altogether appropriate and should not be changed. What should be changed, rather, is that millions are denied the chance to become patients and to have an individual focus trained on them, right? This is a real, I think, important shift that's been the fruit of this kind of ethical reflection that begins with experience, but not just any experience, right? And not just the experience of people who are most like me, as a person who enjoys a considerable amount of privilege. And in New England, that we can kind of look in almost any direction and come across world-class medicine. We're in a privileged region of the world, right? But if my experience commits to beginning with the lived experience of folks who are most vulnerable and most marginalized, and then I bring that right into this sort of pattern of analysis and theological reflection and action, what I'm going to get, right, is a focus on justice as a key principle. If I'm going to think about patients' rights, which in a context where we have a lot of access to medical technology, that often gets framed as my right to refuse treatment, right? But if we pick up Paul Farmer's challenge, right, the first right of any patient is essentially to actually be someone's patient in the first place, right? So this kind of system really allows me not only to kind of focus on the particular kinds of dilemmas about whether I will focus on this patient and pursue a particular course of treatment, or will decide not to, adopt a particular course of treatment, right? That it allows me to to kind of address those kinds of questions. And so some of the kind of, I'll call these sort of interventions, right? But some of the themes then that this process of reflection, theological reflection, has sort of brings me to, and now what I kind of bring to the conversation, right, is a sense that, and this is sort of an old feminist rallying cry, that the personal is political, right? That my personal choices impact me, people who are close to me, but they also have and can have wider social impacts, right? Particularly in my kind of consumption of healthcare, right? That something is deeply personal and sometimes private, and those are not always the same things. But we can make some distinctions between that and a purely privatized view of medicine and healthcare. It allows me to focus on the intrinsic dignity of individual people, their radical uniqueness, while also honoring our radical interdependence on one another as something that's good about life, not just an unfortunate consequence of a sort of human finitude, right? But that we're interdependent and that we're called to be in solidarity with one another. It also allows me then to see that health and healthcare are common goods, right? That being healthy and having access to the institutions of healthcare are things that we all really have to work together to achieve, right? We can't sort of do those as radically individual people, right? And so, you know, in some ways, this leads to some challenges around things like concierge medicine, right? Where, which I think may have a place, right, in healthcare, but that I would have my own private physician and my own private hospital and my own private labs and things like that. That's really kind of untenable, right, for most of us. But it also allows me then kind of coming to close to make a preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, right? And so to kind of sum up, right, one of the reasons why I am so indebted to librarians, right, is because I am a non-scientist who needs to have access to really good scientific information that I can understand. So I'm often navigating unfamiliar databases with studies and things like that that are really not like anything I read or write myself, right? But I also need to kind of come to those with some basic scientific literacy and some media literacy, right? I think my younger colleagues have a lot more of this than I do, but this is invaluable service that our librarians offer here at Holy Cross for me and for my students. You know, we've been talking a lot about, you know, the COVID epidemic and the ethical issues involved there. There's so much misinformation, and people cling to the misinformation and then make very universalizing claims about it. And so the being able to kind of navigate that with colleagues from the sciences and our librarians is really important. And so, you know, I see you all also as sort of anchors for us in a really polarized debate, right? Somebody who is really going to be able to help us navigate that. But also, I think in helping people who are in STEM and the humanities, right, to help us access the resources that tell the stories behind the science, right? Tell the stories about the particulars, about the radically unique individuals who are facing so many of these challenges. And so I'll close with a comment from Atul Gawande and his complications. In the end, it is practical everyday medicine that most interests me. What happens when the simplicities of science come up against the complexities of individual lives, right? As a non-scientist, I'm usually switching those, the complexity of science and my sort of simple life, right? He's really attending here to a new way of thinking. As pervasive as medicine has become in modern life, it remains mostly hidden and often misunderstood. And I think that that's worse now than it was when he wrote this 20 years ago. We have taken it to be both more perfect than it is and less extraordinary than it can be. So, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Roche. That was just a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. So for now, if you are in the audience and you would like to ask a question, please do type it into the Q&A and we will go ahead and read your questions to Dr. Roche. To start us off, I do have a question, and that is, if someone new to bioethics wanted to learn more about this subject, what sources would you recommend to them? Could you give us like an example of 3 specific sources that we should be sure to have on hand in our libraries for your students or other people interested in the topic?
Yeah. So that's great. So I'm quite sure that you probably have plenty of stuff by Beecham and Childress and and things like that. Those are really kind of standards, but they're also, again, kind of in a very particular this sort of particular what do I want to say, principle-based, right, approach. I would also have on hand whatever Paul Farmer you can get your hands on. As a physician and as a medical anthropologist, the passage that I selected for this presentation, right, is Pathologies of Power, but there are also books written about Paul Farmer too that are Mountains Beyond Mountains is another one that is going to really zero in on these issues of equity, right, and give scientists and physicians, public health folks who want to make a really robust ethical claim for the importance of that, is going to give them a lot of language for that, right? And Farmer challenges, really critiques bioethics as a field, right, for focusing primarily on the dilemmas that occur in a context of abundance rather than, right? So when you think bioethics, you think, should we be doing stem cell technology? Should we be doing artificial nutrition and hydration, right? And Farmer is going to say, oh, okay, that's an important question when you reach it in a hospital setting, for sure. He doesn't dismiss that, right? But we have untold numbers of people dying of malnutrition. So the feeding tube thing is not the most moral or not the most urgent, right? Ethical question. Sorry, I'm tripping on myself. So, those things. Pellegrino is also, and he's written widely in a lot of different things. So his work is kind of easily accessible. Things like the Hastings Center report. He's passed away now, but a Google of him, which is what I would do. But you do a database search right on him. And one of the books that I use often, but it's a theological perspective, is a book called Theological Bioethics by Lisa Cahill. She's another Catholic moral theologian, but she really looks at ethics from the context of the common good and what she calls sort of participatory justice, right? So that all of our ethical questions in medicine and healthcare need to kind of focus on the ability of individual people and particular communities, especially underserved communities, to be able to participate fully in the goods of healthcare and to be able to participate in meaningful ways in making decisions, setting policy priorities, and things like that. So.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful answer. I took notes just to ensure that we have these resources available in our library here at Holy Cross. I'm sure we do, but just so I can keep my eye on for
Our
future.
students, and just to tell you, as again, just teaching undergrads, but my students also love reading about lives of people who have made these kind of decisions, faced these challenges. So reading Paul Farmer, they enjoy that. They enjoy reading everything that comes from the pen of Atul Gawande, right? Because it makes it accessible for students, but also makes for my science students, makes things applicable to them in a way. And he's just also a gifted writer, as is Danielle Ofri, Ofri. They read, I have them reading a lot of her work too.
Wonderful. So we do have some questions from the audience. I'm going to read the first one. Are there ways your discipline of bioethics can inoculate the broader society against the virus of disinformation and misinformation that is so prevalent in our media today? It's a tall order, I realize.
It's huge. And I wish we could. We are trying, right? We are trying. And I would say that this, again, as I was talking about really needing access to good information that's accessible, I would say that people in my field also have to do a better job of engaging wider audiences, right? So doing more publicly engaged scholarship. This is, again, I think, a way in which librarians can be particularly helpful to us in terms of where our articles get stored, where they are available to people, how they're shared widely. I want everyone to have a livelihood, but I am interested in as much open access as I possibly can get for people. But like other specialists, we do a lot of time talking to each other, and we do that with lots of jargon. And we will focus on the forest or focused on a tree, and then we miss the forest. And then it was sort of what the general audience, right, gets access to can be, very confusing or not at all. And I will say, as a Catholic bioethicist, right, who is sort of wants to engage in some critical conversation with what the church teaches on a number of these things, because I'm hoping to kind of inoculate maybe the wider public against some bad information, but I'd also like my own faith community to reach some different conclusions than it has. I think it's not consulting experience widely enough. So unfortunately, right, that sometimes when religious communities get airtime, they focus on a very narrow set of moral questions. And then their participation in some of these other justice questions is not as robust and gets sidelined. So people will have a sense, for example, of what the Catholic Church teaches about reproductive questions or about the abortion issue, but will not have any sense of what it teaches about health equity and access to healthcare, and can hold some very, I think, inconsistent moral positions based on what they think the church or their religious community teaches.
Thank you. So we have another question. Thank you for an insightful presentation. An observation: I've been a medical librarian for 20 years and have seen a transition from disdain for qualitative research to a growing acceptance and recognition of the importance of this type of research. I've had to learn about this type of research. My background is STEM, and I too have become a proponent. Qualitative research tells us about the patient and their needs and understanding. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this type of research.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And again, I know that I say that in part because I come from the humanities. So sort of the qualitative things are ones that I more easily wrap my mind around, and can engage. But I do think that, in my experience, that we obviously need sort of both, right? The qualitative and the quantitative. We need our students to have both sets of skills, right? To be able to, again, kind of understand the numbers and the data, right? But also I think, to kind of be able to think about the patients, be able to about the lives, right, that are impacted, how different sort of contexts sort of shape people's experiences. But I think it's also really important that people understand, right, that qualitative research is research. It is still evidence-based research, right? And I think one of the things I think that we're trying to kind of educate people around, right, is the difference between looking at solid qualitative research and kind of anecdotal evidence, right? Or that I know one particular person who had this much to say, right? But I have no way of sort of placing that in any kind of broader context or using that to help me make decisions, right? So I don't know if that answers, except to sort of say I agree with you, and I hope that that more people accessing a medical library are interested in navigating both of those spaces. And I think more sort of team approaches to medicine are also going to lead us right in that direction.
Thank you so much. Next is more of a comment than a question. And it says, I really appreciate you sharing the terminology and concepts that describe the work you've done. I'm fresh off a scoping review on a topic finding ethical approaches for folks with disabilities participating in clinical trials. I was getting pieces of the terminology, but you gave me more and a lot to think about with the broader issue of bioethics from a theological lens.
Great, thank you very much. And please keep doing that good work on disability, which is a growing area in theology for sure, right? And how to make sure that, again, people are able to participate fully. And so that we also know how all of these clinical trials will affect people with different abilities. But also to recognize that they're a vulnerable population that can be easily exploited, right? So how do we find the sweet spot there? Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to thank you again, Dr. Roche. This was just a fantastic presentation, and I believe that we've all learned a lot and have appreciated the information that you shared with us today. So thank you for spending the past hour with us.
Great. Thanks for having me. And Laura knows how to find me if I can be of any assistance. I'm on the website somewhere. So, okay. Thank you.